G'day, folks. My name is Ben Norman. I'll be moderating this webinar today. Today, we're going to be looking at the topic of climate change, particularly as it pertains to the operation and the general world of hatcheries. So we have three very distinguished guests with us here today. We have Tiago, Alex, and Molly. I would take a stab at introducing them, but who better than themselves? So maybe Molly, if you want to hop in and just introduce yourself here.
You bet. I'm Molly Steer, and I'm an engineer on the hatchery assessment team at Four Peaks Environmental Science and Data Solutions. And I've had the opportunity to work with many hatcheries across the country, assessing their infrastructure and operations and evaluating their vulnerability to climate change.
And Carlos, how about yourself?
Hello, everyone. Yep, my name is Carlos Lopez. I'm the Commercial and Operations Manager here at Benchmark Genetics Tilapia, and we provide tilapia breeders to farms across the globe.
And Tiago?
Hi, my name is Tiago Hori. I am the Director of Innovation at Atlantic Aqua Farms, and we are currently working on using hatcheries to mitigate the impacts of climate change in both oyster and mussel grow-out.
Thank you very much, everybody. Just a quick note before we start, there will be a Q&A section at the end of our discussion. If you have a question that you'd like to have addressed, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen here, as opposed to putting them in the chat. It just helps us keep things organized. So without further ado, let's get into some discussion here. Being controlled environments for early life rearing, what are some of the potential strengths of hatcheries in terms of their ability to thrive in the changing climate? Molly, do you want to take this one?
You bet. So I work mostly in land-based hatcheries that are focused more on conservation and stock enhancement. So I'm going to be coming from that perspective. But I think with planning and all the right resources, hatcheries can mitigate and quickly adapt to some of the changes that we're seeing in water quality and quantity. And I think that's probably one of the biggest strengths, is that they can control those environmental parameters. And I think probably one of the biggest things is just being able to continuously monitor and continuously adapt to changes. And also having, especially on land-based hatcheries, if you have the staff that can monitor the fish, their behavior often are going to tell you what's going on prior to your call-out system, letting you know that there's a problem. And so I think that's also a very strong point for hatcheries.
Carlos, Tiago, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, you know, it's control, right? So if you control your water intake, then you're going to be less susceptible to variations in temperature, instability in the environment, because climate change is not only about heating or cooling, right? It's about instability too. We've seen that in PI with storms, increasing number of strong storms, you know, that change the water composition. You see that with ocean acidification, for example, in Maine and the eastern seaboard in the U.S., where they have the ability to buffer their water to prevent the impacts of ocean acidification, calcification of shells, right? So that's one side of the hatchery, is that you have control over several parameters of your water, and then it depends on the magnitude of the changes, and it's going to get expensive, but in the end of the day, if you need to, you can condition your water to whatever you need it to be. Even in the sense of pathogens, you can probably, if you work hard enough, you can probably get everything out of the water.
Yep, I think that's it. I think you guys covered it. Yeah, hatcheries are smaller footprints. You can have a smaller footprint. You can maybe move things indoors to control all of your parameters. You can have easier to filter all the water and do temperature control, since it is in a hatchery, smaller footprint, smaller water demand typically than any grow out. So yeah, I agree.
Right on. So Carlos, let's start with you on this one too. One facet of the conversation around climate change is this changing landscape of pathogens, right? We're seeing difference in distribution. We're seeing differences in ability to adapt across various parts of the world. So what could this look like in the world of hatchery?
Yep. So we're definitely seeing this in the field in the tilapia industry. We are seeing different pathogens affect that we maybe didn't see before. some pathogens that were typically more of a cold water pathogen historically. Now we're seeing those kind of pathogens affect in warmer temperatures. And on the hatchery side of things, we're also seeing pathogens actually coming in and affecting breeding, not just mortality in broodstock, but we're also seeing pathogens affect gonad development and actual like fecundity of breeders. So these are things that we didn't always see these challenges before, but we're definitely in the last few years starting to see challenges like this. And there's various facets that may be affecting this, you know, so not just temperature, but less water available, so lower water quality on some of these farms that we see around the world. So definitely seeing pathogens affecting in hatcheries.
And especially with the changing profile of which ones you're seeing where as well too, it you know, presents potentially an opportunity for people to, you know, maybe get caught with their pants down, unfortunately, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, these are pathogens that you wouldn't even check for before if you had temperatures above 23°C. Now we're seeing them affect in temperatures of 28°C. So yeah, definitely.
Thiago, do you think we covered that one, or do you have anything you'd like to add there?
I think the one thing I would notice is not on pathogens, right? So one of the things that we're really concerned with warming water is distribution of tunicates, and whether tunicates from warmer waters will be able to become invasive in the Northern Atlantic. And also we've seen now, we don't have any hard data, but it appears that even the tunicates that we have here, and notoriously Stiona, is surviving throughout the winter in a way that they didn't used to. Now, we don't know if they adapted or if because the winters haven't been as rigorous, but it's entirely possible that they're now overwintering because the winters are no longer as intense as they used to be. So, I mean, it's not only about pathogens, right? It's about distribution of everything, predators, and, you know, there's places that they have problems with predators in the cages. Like all of these things can change in distribution, and things that we never thought could be in the Northern Atlantic might appear here.
Alrighty. Genetics play such a huge part in the success of a species in this given environment and in the face of certain pathogens, invasives, like you mentioned as well. So a large part of hatchery operations is around selective breeding in a lot of operations. So do you see breeding programs becoming more or less important in a changing climate, and why?
I mean, it's the only solution, right? Like if you think about thermotolerance or disease resistant, those are enormously complex diseases, multi-loci, you know, very complicated diseases, right? And then you see what happens when you develop antibiotic resistance. You see what happens in Chile with the salmon, and a huge piece of the market that they lose because they just had to use so much antibiotic to fight SRS, right? So, like, you know, realistically, to breed local resistance strains for any of these animals really is our best, if not only, chance against climate change. And I mean, temperature resistance is as complicated as disease, or if not more. And then you have to worry about the interactions between disease and temperature and hypoxia, temperature and disease, right? And so what I think is going to change is that we're going to see more and more what we see in plants, for example, which is cultivar, the concept of cultivar, which is local specific strains. So you can't do the model of for example, they have in Norway one or two large breeding programs supplying eggs for the whole industry, right? Where I think more and more we'll see people producing local specific strains that are resistant to a certain combination of stressors. Because you can't have it all, right? That's the other thing. It's impossible to select for everything. Something has got to give. So.
That's right. If we could fix it all with breeding, we would have done it already. Molly, would you like to jump in on that?
I think that Thiago covered it. I mean, there's a lot of new hatchery technologies that are being developed to enhance broodstock quality. They can produce the specific pathogen-free or fast-growing seed stock, but you know, it's going to take time, and there's obviously we're going to run up against what Thiago was talking about, where you have you're accelerating some good things, but along with it are coming some, traits that we don't want. So I don't know, there's a lot of lower cost genomic tools as well. So we can keep working on it. I think that's the thing, is that there's a lot of research being done right now that will hopefully help out in the future as well.
And yeah, no, and in my opinion, I think breeding programs are a fundamental part of the aquaculture industry, without a doubt. And I do think there's a huge importance to having highly biosecure breeding nucleuses, because you can't have your breeders next to the large production areas, because there's too much risk for kind of cross-contamination from your grow out areas. So I think it's important to have a highly biosecure breeding nucleus that can keep a very clean stock to supply kind of breeders to your region or whatnot. And breeding programs, absolutely, because breeding programs are constantly adapting. With every generational interval, you're getting a new batch of breeders, right? That are constantly, breeding programs are always going to be steered towards what the market is looking for, and the market's adapting to new pathogens, new challenges, temperature, etc. So the breeding programs are very malleable and can adapt with any kind of changing conditions that we're seeing in various regions of the world. And I think as we get more and more involved with genomics, and they become the technology is there, it's just more or less right now is a cost is what's prohibitive for everybody to use full genomics. So as genomics become more friendly price, and is with volumes and all that, then we can use more of that technology and select more precise for maybe specific regions of the world, as Thiago was mentioning.
Yeah, I think one caveat I put, because I am a genomic scientist. That's what I used to do for years, establishing genomic selection breeding programs. But one caveat I would say is that, if you look at the poultry industry and if you look at plants, they've been doing that with traditional selection for 300 years, right? So you don't need genomics. Of course, genomics can increase your precision and decrease the generation time to get to a better phenotype. But I mean, really, what we really need to do is to start, right? Because every generation counts. And if you don't have money, you're going to need more generations, right? And I mean, the other thing that I would say is that it's very rare to see in aquaculture things like you see both in plants, bovines, and poultry, which is combined industry-wide breeding programs, which are stronger. A classical example is the breeding program of oysters in France, which involves, I think, the 3 or 4 major producers, and they're doing genomic selection because they have the money now. Like the 4 people, so you're paying 1/4 of the price per sample, right? So then that's an easy way of making genomics feasible. Cut the price by 75%. So some government money into there, you're paying very little for array data, right? So I think that that's something that we keep talking about, reducing the cost of the tools, but we, like tilapia and mussels and, these things that are literally going to feed the world in the future, because they are, they're good protein with, a good cost, right? It's an available protein for the vast majority of the world, like while salmon is not, right? But at the same price, because it's cheap for a reason, right? And so for these species, we're going to have to really think carefully about how we go about getting into genomics.
Yeah, definitely agree with you.
Thiago, to run with that idea there, particularly these species where we haven't seen as much sort of genetically based selected breeding programs, like what are some of the barriers to developing programs in those spaces?
The major one is to close the reproduction cycle, right? Because it's different to produce fish to put in a place and having to produce 100 families with the same number of individuals every year. And then the other one is money, right? Because if you're going to do a 100 family breeding program, you either need 100 family tanks, which then you do nothing else in your hatchery, so you just become a breeding program, or you're going to invest in genotyping. And either work, but it's an investment. Now, what is hard in the agriculture industry is that people don't look at return of the investment in the long term, right? They tend to look at it on the short term. So it's costly, but on an unselected species, you can probably increase growth by 50% in 4 generations, right? So, I mean, what is the cost of the investment ahead? But most of the species that don't have anything in that sense is because they just have trouble producing families or reproducibly spawning them. And you see that in bats, you see that in almost all the cereolas, because they have these complex reproductive behaviors, which makes it very tricky, because like in bats, you can't do single families because you won't cross, right? So, then someone has to figure out how to do strip spawn, which is not as easy as it may sound. And so that, I mean, those are the issues, I think. And then the cheaper the protein is, the harder it is to justify a breeding program, right? How many dollars do you invest on a single individual, and what is the return on that individual? So you have to be able to look forward. I think what's changing the industry now is that more and more big money behind the industry that can think forward. Because breeding programs, you can't think of returns in 5 years. You have to look at returns in 10 years. It can take 10 years for you to make your money back. And if you're not looking 10 years down the road, then it's never going to be worth it.
Yeah, that's where I think in the tilapia industry, what we're seeing now is there's consolidation in the breeding programs. It's not an individual farm is going to have their own kind of complex breeding program. The return is too far away. So there's consolidation, and there's going to be, right now there's just a handful of really kind of fully professional breeding programs for tilapia in the world right now.
Challenging situation, there's no question there. So just keeping with that trend of challenges, we've talked a bit about the strengths of hatcheries as a production space for in a changing climate, but where do we see potential weaknesses of hatcheries in terms of their ability to thrive in changing climate? Molly, maybe you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I think anytime you have a heavy reliance on the ambient environment, you're going to set yourself up to be vulnerable, because things are changing and it's not stable, and it's not nearly as stable as it used to be. And we're seeing, not only changes in water quality and quantity, but seeing the effects of some of these climate events that are huge in causing sediment transport and erosion and wildfires and all of that that are also affecting these hatcheries. And mass mortality events, those are going to be one of the biggest problems for hatcheries. When you have a pathogen, you're going to lose all the fish in the tank, if you don't catch it fast enough. And there's a lot more stress on the fish as we're handling it. We need to reduce the stress, and some of these things that we're trying to change for the changing climate, when we're cooling the water and changing the quality. We're doing all the right things, but it also sets us up for catastrophic failures. So you have to have backups on backups as well. So I think then you're starting to look at economic sustainability for, if you have a small hatchery and they're bringing in all this equipment to try to mitigate the effects of climate change, and it can introduce a lot of catastrophic events that are going to cause mass mortality. So you have to stay on top of everything. I think one of the most important things is just to make sure that you know your systems and that your staff is well trained to see what's coming down the pike and handling it if anything does happen. But I think there are a lot of we do introduce a lot of problems when we're trying to fix some of them.
Yeah, and if you look at what happened with BKD in Norway, right? So once you introduce a pathogen into your lineages, it's very hard to get rid of it. So hard with BKD case that they had to just start again, right? Kill every single broodstock they had, test the new ones, and then make their hatcheries BKD free. But once you introduce a pathogen into your hatchery, it's very hard to get rid of it unless you're willing to just mount everything, bleach everything, and start again, right? Which is a luxury that most hatcheries don't have. So
Right.
that's always also a problem. And I think just on what Molly was saying, I think that's where data-driven machine learning monitoring systems are going to be important, right? Because the human can't respond fast enough anymore, right? So you're going to need systems. And not only that, you're going to need predictive systems too, right? Can we predict changes in certain qualities based on continuous monitoring? And if you look at it, the monitoring part, for example, is still quite behind for water when it's compared to the land, right? So there is a need there for remote monitoring. You can do temperature, sometimes you can do oxygen, but that's about it, right? So Internet of Things, making these things really deployable and really wireless, it's going to be key, because you're not going to get a wire. Well, you could, but I mean, get wires to all your sea cages on a salmon farm. That's going to be kind of, not great. So we have to start looking at remote monitoring, drones, and all that technology, because that's what we need for the future to be able to respond. And we talk a lot about we have to transition from resistance to resilience.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the weaknesses of hatcheries to a changing climate is that in the hatchery, you're dealing with fish at their most vulnerable stage. So the early life stages, the fish are much more, or any seal aquaculture species, I guess, would be much more vulnerable at this stage. So any small little changes really can affect your stock in a big way. And as Molly was saying, so if we mitigate for temperature by intensifying and closing everything indoors, then any kind of issues do exacerbate, as opposed to an extensive farm. If the power's off for a few hours, it doesn't matter, everything's at low density. But once you kind of have to bring everything indoors and you intensify, power's out in 15 minutes, everything could be gone. So that's kind of like the weakness that you could see in the hatchery.
So we've highlighted some of these weaknesses here, and operators are going to be trying to translate that into, how do I look at my facility and sort of prepare for the future, right? People like Molly or Carlos, you guys are working with these folks to be able to sort of paint that picture for themselves. But what are some areas that operators should really try to look at now? Where should they be trying to poke holes in their own operation to make themselves more resilient?
Yeah, I could take some. I think what we're adapting with right now in the tilapia industry is going towards more controlled environments for hatcheries. So we're bringing like breeders into more controlled environments, as opposed to kind of large, extensive ponds that have traditionally been used for tilapia breeding. As far as incubation and early life stages, we're bringing that all kind of indoors into smaller, more controlled tanks and more intensified. So you're using higher densities, but everything is under more control. We have better water quality, filtration, and using recirculation systems and temperature controls, whether heating or cooling, depending where we are, which environment we're dealing with. But I think that's definitely how we're adapting hatcheries and where the hatcheries of the future are going. And a lot of the farms are starting to do this process now, even if they're not getting 100% affected now. They're looking, okay, 5-10 years down the road, what are the trends looking like? We need to intensify, we need to modernize our hatcheries, and that's certainly what we're seeing play out and basically all over the world right now in the tilapia industry.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the hatcheries that we're looking at are obviously struggling with water quantity and quality. And so you're seeing a lot of bringing it indoors and doing the recirculating aquaculture systems so that you can maximize the resources that you do have, even though they're diminishing. And there are a lot of different options, especially for some of these smaller hatcheries out there, where if they can find a different water source, even if they can drill a well and get groundwater, and because their surface water is either depleted or getting too warm, or if they can bring in chillers or anything like that. We've seen some really creative problem solving at these hatcheries that they don't have a lot of money, but they're finding ways to make this work, and then dealing with the other issues that come with it, like the biosecurity and stuff. So it's there are options out there. Of course, some of them cost a lot of money, but I think people are getting creative, and there's a lot of work and thought going into it from the hatchery managers and operators, which is great to see.
Kelly, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
I'm good. I think they tackled everything.
Good. So grow-out operations are challenged by climate change, and we know this. This is perhaps the most sort of widely discussed aspect where climate change and aquaculture kind of come to a head together. So hatcheries, however, as we've been talking about, certainly will be impacted, and there's certainly some great considerations around their operation in the face of a changing climate. So where do those two things intersect? What role do hatcheries play in supporting grow-out operations with their adaptation? We've talked a bit about genetic breeding and getting these young juveniles ready to go out. What are some other areas where hatcheries can support grow-out operations?
Yeah, I think that you see, for example, there's an emerging data there. It's less, at least in shellfish, of the importance of epigenetics effects on broodstock, leading to different resistance in the progeny. And if we can really narrow that down, the hatchery can just do a lot by just exposing the broodstock to mild stressors and generating a progeny that is better adapt to certain environments. And you see that in other species too. So, but of course, we're very far understanding epigenetics in humans. We're very far understanding epigenetics in aquatic animals. But that's definitely one thing. And I think in the shellfish industry, it's just we are still too dependent on wild seed, right? The way the hatcheries are going to save this industry is because one day there's not going to be more wild seed. It's not going to be in 10 years. It's not going to be in 20 years, but it's going to happen. It's going to be a point where there will not be enough wild seed, right? We had to get on that, and because to maintain that industry, we need to be able to produce seed in hatcheries, and that's true for anything that depends on wild collections, not only us. You need to be able to do it, otherwise, chances are it's gonna crash eventually.
Yeah, I think hatcheries definitely play a really important role in the on-growing or grow-out cycle, starting with providing a robust, fingerling, healthy fingerling out to the grow-out cycle is a good start. You don't want to start with a fish that's already kind of stressed or possibly already carrying some kind of pathogen load while going out to grow out. And number two, I think what we're seeing is as the grow-out conditions get more and more challenging, the hatchery is no longer sending a small fish. Maybe you have to hold the fish a little bit larger before you go to grow out. Particularly in tilapia industry, we're seeing is now ideally you'd keep these fish in your hatchery or controlled environment until you could actually reach a size where you can vaccinate the fish. So then the fish could be kind of larger size, already graded and vaccinated going out to the grow out cycle. So that has less handling and less stress, and the fish is more robust and able to deal with the more challenging environment in the grow out. So that's definitely where we're seeing the trend. And I think, the term hatchery might just be growing.
Yeah, I think the concept between the difference between hatchery and nursery is something that is kind of blurred. It's a distinction that it's mostly non-made in fish, but it's made very clearly in shellfish. But I think those two things are going to end up being very important. You see research coming out of New Zealand for green shells that say that you have 30 to 50% more retention if you wait a little bit more to put them out. Cook is putting a $50 million facility in Nova Scotia to grow most 300 grams, right? And that's a lot of money. They're talking about 500 grams in Norway, right? As most, because that's the thing. You throw a 50-gram smoke in the water that was grown in fresh water, that's nasty for the animal, right? And the same is true for any salmon specific, because salmon's crazy, right? Couldn't pick up a more difficult life history than salmon. But in certain extent to every other species. You're taking them from a controlled environment and putting them in a non-controlled environment. It's not great.
I think Carlos and Tiago covered it well. I mean, the huge thing is the biological resilience. If we can get that going and put them out there at a larger size and control the stocking density, I think we might need to look into that a little bit more. It's the best we can do.
Yeah, and I think it really becomes important, this idea of what are the supporting technologies that have to come around. So really for us, aquaculture is huge, right? And it's getting there. But mass aquaculture in decent controlled way that is feasible does not exist, right? Everybody's doing like ponds or something to that, nature. It works, but it's not great. You have no control over the composition of your feed, and feeding systems, because now you can't if you're going to grow a salmon or a tilapia to whatever bigger size it is, you can't be wasting food, right? So we need better technologies to determine satiation, to make sure you're not wasting food. We need better feeds. We need feeds that are tailored for recirculating systems with low ammonia production, where the pellets don't dissolve so easily. You can get rid of them as a solid rather than having them becoming protein. So there's a whole level of technology around the hatchery that has to move forward in order for the hatchery to be able to do what it needs to do, right? And one of the really interesting things that they're using, Mark, I think, has a technology to look at feeding in cages using AI, but that should be much easier in a tank, which I never understood why they started at a cage. But anyway, because in a hatchery should be much, much, much easier to do, to train a model, right? Expert feed, it has their bucket that works depending on who you ask. But, those technologies are going to be important, because otherwise, we can talk a lot about what we need to do, but if the technology and the tools to do it don't exist, we're not going to get anywhere. And I think there's two important elements to that. One is the industry, the academia that exists around aquaculture has to be more in tune with the industry. And then we have to have funding, right? Funding to do these things, to fund startups, to get the industrial planktons of life out of the ground, becoming larger sustainable companies, so we can use those technologies, right? Because right now we're not doing any bag, right? We're not any bag growth or tank growth. We just use their reactors, and they're great. But that company struggled, right, to get off the ground. Luckily, it stayed. It had partners that kept them going, but we can't lose those opportunities. And just in the AI world, there's so many startups trying to do AI in aquaculture, right? We have to identify the good ones and support them, even as an industry, not only as like public funding, but as an industry. But I think it's also very important. We need, and I don't know what the solution is, but we need the academia to be more connected to the industry in terms of the research that they do, because otherwise it's just esoteric, crazy stuff that we can't apply, and it's just we're gonna stop putting matching funds into programs, right? Because what's the point?
I think you touched on something really interesting here, Tiago, about the idea that AI in particular. I mean, this is quite it's a developing technology, it's an emerging technology. People are doing some very exciting things with AI, and you're right, we're seeing a lot of development on the cage side and not necessarily so much on the hatchery side. But you mentioned that it's a better environment for that. Why do you say that?
Because it's controlled, right? So like in a cage, you don't control the clarity of the water. You don't control how many fish are swimming. So in the Merck system, they have to force the fish to go to the tunnel, right? So they can take a picture of, the multi-camera can take a picture of the fish without like having 300 fish swimming at. So those things should be much easier to do in a tank or in a tank system, right? You can do it to a grading system, and then again, less volume of water, predictive methods are going to work way better in controlled recirculating systems. You can put your feeding input, your total biomass, state of your filters, yada, yada, yada. And you can develop these predictive methods to say, look, ammonia might become a problem, oxygen might become a problem. This is the ideal flow for this system with this number of animals, blah, 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 right? So those things seem to me that they are where we should start, because these models should be easy because you can control some of the variables. You're out in the cage, and it's like predicting the weather, right? You know, people complain that the weather prediction is often wrong, but you should look at weather prediction the other way. It's incredible that they get it right ever, because, you know, it's millions of variables, right, into those models. So the fact that they can get that right is incredible. But working on the cage is a little bit like working with the weather.
Yeah, so much unpredictability in that way for sure. So let's take that a little step further here and say, you know, we're talking about AI as being a useful tool in here, but let's paint a wider picture here. In a changing climate, what is the sort of ideal hatchery of the future look like here? And, you know, this is a thought experiment, so budget's not a concern here, folks. Carlos, maybe you want to start with this one.
Yeah, I think the hatchery of the future is certainly going to be indoors, climate controlled, RAS, with a high biosecurity, and trying to find the best water source you can find. So a high water quality, or the best water quality available, and then filter down to the exact parameters needed for whatever species you're working with. And I think that's certainly, like, you know, just I do see the hatchery of the future being more kind of intense and more controlled, as opposed to, you know, extensive as we've seen traditionally. And yeah, that's certainly what I see. And then as these technologies continue to develop for monitoring systems, AI for feeding, and I know those models already exist now for grow out in RAS, but I think, like as I was saying, these things could start transferring more and more into hatcheries, and that's how I see the hatcheries of the future. And of course, starting with a really good broodstock, you know, broodstocks that are coming from breeding programs, and these breeding programs are just going to continue to get more and more advanced, and you know, really kind of what we call is like tailor-made genetics. So you can have the hatchery of the future will have a tailor-made genetics for your particular situation, your type of grow out system or whatnot, and then passing that through your modern hatchery, taking fish to a larger size to then pass out to your grow out. And, you know, it depends where you blur the line of hatchery nursery, but yeah, everybody has a different definition there. But that's what I see the hatcheries of the future.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see a lot more image recognition programs. And I know that Carlos and Thiago both hit on this, but, you know, using big data, we can use this data for predictive analytics and machine learning and AI and all of that. We can get a lot more automation with the feeding and vaccinating. With the image recognition, you don't have to handle them as much. You can look at anomalies or biomass. So I think that there will be a lot more automation, and the ability, if people continue to gather all this data, you know, we can all use it to make a better hatchery.
Yeah, and I think one element that is not kind of so clear, it's like, if we're going to do this properly, we have to collect data properly, right? The saying in the machine learning world is garbage in, garbage out, right? Your data is garbage, your conclusions are garbage, right? And so that's why automation also plays an enormous role, because then it's predictable error, it's consistent readings. It's much easier to depend to do that. You know, you see that in plants, and you see on wheat ground, right? They're using multispectral cameras to detect wheat density in the fields using drones, which is much more effective than having someone counting, right? And it has an error, obviously, but it's a predictable error, right? That you can account. The human error is absolutely unpredictable. And so, you know, I think our ability to collect data, store data, and analyze data on the fly. It's gonna, again, is one of these supporting technologies that are gonna have to evolve and become available in a somewhat decent price, and able to do the so-called, the hatchery of the future. But I think that all those things are important.
Well, thanks for that, guys. Absolutely. I know one of the hats I wear is as an instructor with Fleming College in Ontario and the aquaculture program there. And you see a lot of discussion amongst the young people these days getting into the industry. What does the future look like in our industry? Where are we going to be? How are we doing what we're doing, etc. One big motivator for people is a sense of hope, right? So when you're thinking towards the future and hatcheries, what brings you guys hope? Molly, you want to start on this?
I think for me, one of the main things that gives me hope is just seeing the passion behind all of the hatchery managers and the operators. They're making the hard decisions to make the even more difficult changes to their hatcheries to do this right, and embracing new technology and creative problem solving, which I see a lot. It's a team sport. We all need to share our knowledge and experience, and I think I'm seeing that a lot more in the industry, where everybody is working together and trying to help this out. So I'm just seeing a lot of witnessing a lot of problem solving and teamwork. I think that just the passion behind it is phenomenal.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly very optimistic on the outlook of the future. I mean, as everybody knows, fish farmers are really, really handy at adapting to situations kind of live and under moment, under stress. So I think we'll be even better at adapting to things that we can project with a little bit of more long range. I think a lot of these technologies might already exist today, so that gives me a lot of optimism. We just have to kind of implement them more into hatcheries and just work out the economics. So I think that gives me a lot of optimism that we'll be okay. It's just we'd have to just keep adapting kind of day by day. And I think aquaculturists are experts in adapting every day and finding solutions with not enough budget and a lot of stress. So I think that we're an industry that's certainly set up to keep adapting and surviving. So I'm very optimistic on that front.
I mean, I think there's other thing I think that we have to do a little bit more of, like, education around some of these technologies. So a lot of non-believers in AI and machine learning and those things, and I don't blame them. But you have to look at the other side, right? The fact that Alexa works, it's incredible, right? You have a computer that can actually, model words into numbers and understand what you're saying. That is absolutely mind-boggling. We take that for granted. Siri or Alexa, we take it, the algorithms that run Google and suggest you the new product and whatever, we take all those for granted. But that's all model driven. That's all big data, right? There's examples in medicine, and there's examples in apples, and there's examples in the Apple guys have these little rovers that count apples on the trees, like in real time, using GPU units, right? So it's incredible. What's out there is absolutely incredible and mind-boggling. So the future is bright, but if we can't be too skeptical, because you have to always be skeptical of things that promise too much, but we can't be too skeptical, because otherwise we're gonna stay behind. And we've been behind for years, right? We have to run at some point, because we are already behind.
Well, thanks, guys. I feel awfully hopeful right now. But on that positive note, maybe let's transition into some questions. So first question up here, we have, what are the effective pathogen control methods in a RAS and non-RAS system?
So can you repeat that, Ben?
So what are the effective pathogen control methods in a RAS and non-RAS system?
I mean, I don't know. I think Carlos probably can talk better about it, because, the fish world faces more pathogens I mean, the classical ones are physical filtration and UV. You know, I think the challenge that we're seeing in oysters now is that there's growing evidence that when you strip too much out of the water, you strip the microbiome out of it, and that's not great. And so, you know, you either reach a balance on that or use probiotics. But I mean, I don't think anything, you know, beats physical filtering and, you know, and UV, for example. And that you have to be, that's why monitoring is important, right? Make sure that you're getting rid of your suspended solids. Make sure you're getting rid of your dissolved solids and organic matter, so then your UV works. You know, so like you can back engineer your filtering system to make sure that it goes from drum filter to mash filter to bag filter, so that by the end it gets into the UV. It's not only almost free of microbes, but it's also almost free of things that will impede your UV from working. And then PI is a great example for that, because there's so much silt in the water, right? If you were to take the raw water UV here, do nothing, right? They're all going to be inside of those silt particles and not nothing. You know, you're going to end up full of bacteria in it. So, and understanding your animal, right? That's the other thing. Like, understand your animal. I think it's one of them. But that's for everything, right? You know, we always have to remind ourselves that fish and shellfish, these are so diverse, right? Like comparing a tilapia to a salmon is like comparing a human to like a lizard in evolutionary times, right? So you just have to bear that in mind, because what works in salmon is probably not going to work in tilapia.
Yeah. As far as filtering, there's technologies that exist, as Thiago's alluding to there, with UV. There's ozone. There's different kinds of filters if you're in a RAS system, and then a non-RAS if you're talking like more traditional farming. And if you can't actually physically filter all the water, then there is people using like probiotics to help you. It's just a different strategy for kind of excluding space so that pathogens can't exist in the water. And then I think there's a lot of, you know, as far as there's just, I think good animal husbandry can go a really, really long way, making sure fish are not stressed. There's good animal welfare. Fish don't have handling stress or handling injuries to then go into an environment that might have some kind of a pathogen load. So.
Yeah, and understand that risk-free is not a thing, right? There's no such thing as anything that is risk-free. You just accept a risk, and you have to do your homework and figure out what is the risk that you're willing to accept. I'm gonna throw some bacteria in the water. Okay. Do you trust the guy that do the analysis that it's only bacillus and they're not all kinds of crazy stuff? I don't know. Depends on who makes it. Everything is risk. It's all risk management, right? If you try to have no risk, a perfect water, a perfect hatchery, you're gonna fail, right? Understand your risk. Determine what your risk tolerance is and go from there. Because then you can say, how much do I filter this water? How clean do I want it? Do I need a biofilter? Yada, 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 right? What is the risk you're willing to take? And that's going to inform your filtering more than anything else. You know, and as long as you understand the advantages and the disadvantages, you can manage the risk. And it's going to go wrong, by the way. No matter what choice you make.
Sometimes that's just the way. Absolutely. Molly, do you have anything else to chuck in there?
No, I think they covered it all.
Right on. Well, the next question is for you specifically, actually. This person, an anonymous attendee, would like to hear Molly's thoughts on how to implement some of these recommendations for Pacific salmon hatcheries with large production and are having to deal with shrinking glaciers, warmer summers, low water flow, increased water temperatures, all the challenges we were talking about. So I think they're looking specifically for information in the Pacific salmon hatchery realm.
Absolutely, and this is something we are running into a lot. Depending on the hatchery, there are a lot of different options and way people, you know, directions people can go. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of RAS, so if that's a possibility, do it. It mitigates risk and maximizes your resources. As far as water temperature, we have some of these hatcheries that are at the base of a dam. they're getting their intake from the reservoir, but the reservoir is lowering. They're getting bath water from the top of the reservoir at this point to supply their hatchery. Salmon don't like bath water. So we're looking at putting in a deeper intake or bringing on the chillers, which obviously is, both of those options are expensive and you have to do a risk analysis on any of it. For some of the ones that are just using surface water, you can look into digging wells for groundwater to get the cooler water, and then you don't have to worry quite as much about pathogens and things like that. We're seeing a lot of different ways people are handling it. I think those are the main ones, is just looking at what you can do with the water source you have, how to use less water, and if there is something different that you can do, and start thinking outside of the box as far as where your water supply is coming from.
Very good. Carlos, this might be best answered by you. We're being asked here, which of the feeds is best for tilapia fingerlings? So which feed formulations, companies, et cetera, have you seen good success with?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question because it just depends which region you are. There's not all the same companies in every different region, and we've had some pretty good success with on the smaller sizes with some companies that are making these micro extruded pellets. So down to very small sizes, because we get less bleaching in the water and keeps the water quality better. But as far as companies and formulations, it's be difficult to get into that because there's just way too much depending on which region we're working with and all that. So that'd be a difficult question to ask broadly, to answer broadly.
Very fair, absolutely. We have another question here about selection of brood stock from wild sources. So Tiago, you'd be very familiar with this process, especially just in the world of shellfish, but and they're asking in the context of, for example, the Heat Dome in British Columbia event where we saw great shellfish die-offs, but those that survived clearly are resistant to that sort of stressor. So are we seeing in the world of genetic selection, are we seeing more or less selection from wild stocks that are perhaps surviving these events very well?
So there are many examples of that, right? Usually in disease, when you see high mortalities, you produce something that's, kind of resistant. The risk with these populations is that's a bottleneck environment, right? And so the diversity could be low. We have the luxury shellfish that they have like one mutation every 30 base pairs. Insane like that, right? So reducing variability in shellfish is kind of hard, even with major mortality events, but in fish, you see that a lot, right? I think you have to think in reverse. Before you start your breeding program, understand the variability of your traits in your environment. And then make sure that if you need to, you can introduce that variability into your breeding program, but you have to know it exists. If you do the homework before, you could be able to introduce genetics. And the other side of that, that's where gene editing becomes really interesting, right? Because then if you can identify causal genes in terms of these traits, then it's easier to identify the variant in the wild and put it back in your population. And then the other example is and the other alternative to crossbreeding, right? So you could have a population that is selected from an environment that is resistant and keep that as a strain and do crossbreeding. You're gonna lose some here and some there. You might, but the hybrid vigor might get you where you want. Get some of that trait. So there are ways of doing that, but I think if you start with the variability, understanding the variability, that's the safest way, because then if the variability is captured in your breeding program, then if you're doing your homework, that variability shouldn't disappear. And therefore, the genetic potential to resist the environment and being selected should still exist in your breeding population if you do your homework, right? So I work with the guys, say because otherwise you're gonna end up with bananas, right? No variability whatsoever. And then you have a new disease and there's nothing you can do other than gene editing, because there is no variability whatsoever to be tapped to find resistance, right? So and that's where doing things properly is going to be important. Track your diversity, track your inbreeding, use a large number of families, accept the loss in per generation gain by selecting less aggressively. Those things are very important.
Good. Carlos, Molly, you have anything you'd like to contribute to that?
Yeah, I could just say, I know for us in the breeding program here with tilapia, we do select for disease tolerance, but it's offsite, and it's infection by cohabitation or by injection, depending on which pathogen. It could be intraperitoneal or intramuscular injection of XYZ pathogen, and then we do selection based off of the results of that, because it's difficult to just take a couple survivors from natural outbreak, because you have to make sure, like Ted was saying, that you have to have some kind of variability, and then you have to have heritability after that. So it's not just take 2 or 3 survivors and that'll be the end of the solution. So we have to have something to select from to put back into the breeding program. So we do it typically in a controlled environment where we seek a 50% mortality, and then you take the survivors from there and you breed from that. So that's how we work the breeding program angle in tilapia.
At the end of the day, again, it's risk, right? There is an incompatibility between diversity and selection. Let's just say, right? You can't do both. So you have to be able to live with it, right? And I think one of the importance, again, when you understand the variability, is to understand the variability of population and make sure you can tap that variability. So, have access to the variability that is in the wild before the mortality event occurs, right? Before your diversity gets all reduced, right? So if you do your homework and you start right, so one of the big mistakes that breeding programs do is because they're cheap in the beginning, because nobody has money. So you'll start with 5, 10, 20 families. No, like if you're gonna start the way you have to be. Find the money, because otherwise you're gonna pay in 10 years, right? So I mean that would be my advice.
Does anybody here have any experience with catfish? This is one of the questions coming up here.
No, but I can point you the right direction. Guy down in Mississippi called Jack Walt Beezer, and he's the king of catfish hatcheries and genetics. He's a very nice guy, and I'm sure whatever questions you have, he'll be glad to answer.
Very good. Thank you for that. How about any experience with circadian rhythm lighting in a RAS environment?
I'll leave that to the fish people.
I mean, I've definitely seen it in use in hatcheries, but I don't have much experience on the results from that, and if there is, if they're able to quantify differences. How about you, Carlos?
Yeah, there's definitely something there, and there's some research on this, but I wouldn't say I'm the expert on this either. But there's definitely something towards lighting and having better growth in the hatchery, but I'm not the expert on this.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think other than reproduction, I don't think we really understand it, right? So 12-12 is pretty standard. There are people that do all light. Like and my joke with the fish people is because we don't even agree whether oysters detect light or not, right? And whether that matters or not. So for the longest time, they don't have eyes, so it doesn't matter. But there's some evidence that it might matter, So it's just, again, it's not only researching circadian rhythms, but it's researching it in a way that is relevant to the industry. And that's what we need, because I don't have time to keep playing with circadian rhythms in here and try to figure out what the better life cycle for oysters are, right? And like we need that support. We need that support in a way that's going to produce data that's worth our dollars.
We have a question here. Are any of you familiar with reactive oxygen species, gas phase, hydrogen peroxide, and low concentration levels of ozone that further sanitize room air and surfaces as opposed to water?
No.
Okay, we have a question here as well. How to best prevent rubbing injuries aside from not disturbing the fish?
Yeah, here, I think definitely there's a lot of animal husbandry that could take into account depending on what life stage you're at. I know in the hatcheries that we're implementing our protocols now is basically keeping the fish in water the whole time. So we're a lot traditional handling had a lot more like netting the fish, move them from life stage 1 to life stage 2, et cetera, like that. So we're kind of redesigning the hatcheries where we keep the fish in water the whole time. So kind of elevating these tanks, so you can kind of harvest out of the bottom of the tank, keeping the fish in water. So I think that is the main way to keep injuries off the fish, keeping them in water, not netting fish or extra handling. And as far as when you're grading and all that, having like the new graders are getting really excellent, like these bar graders, keeping them wet, they don't damage the fish. You can, as you go on live stages, use fish pumps and all that, so that you keep the fish in water. I think is key to preventing kind of physical injuries. And then, of course, using anesthetics, right? So using anesthesia prior to fish handling keeps the fish calm, so they're not fighting and any kind of handling that you're going to give the fish.
Another thing we're seeing in some of the aging infrastructure at these hatcheries is the cement raceways that are starting to erode and getting really rough and things. So there's, opportunities to do liners or refinishing them and making sure they aren't stocked too densely in there, to try to help out with preventing those injuries.
Or just come work with animals that don't swim. It's much easier.
In some ways.
Yeah, certainly very few rub injuries and muscles, that's for sure. So, well, I don't see any more questions here, folks. Carlos, Thiago, Molly, it's been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate your contributions here, as I'm sure everyone else does as well. If there's any parting thoughts you guys would like to share, please feel free at this time.
No, again, thank you for the invitation, and thank everybody who attended. And certainly, I stay optimistic, and I know that we'll continue to adapt, and hatcheries will certainly be at the forefront, I think, of any adaptations that we can make. Hatcheries are going to be the leading edge of this, I believe, since it is dealing with the more vulnerable life stages. So we'll see effects of a changing climate in the hatchery potentially first. So that's where the first changes will need to be made, and so on and so forth. So yeah, but I'm optimistic, and we have a lot of smart people in the industry and working on solutions, and I'm sure we'll be okay. We have to just keep working at it.
Absolutely. I'm optimistic as well. And I thank you for the opportunity. I learned a lot from you guys. So thank you. That's great.
Excellent. Very good. Thanks, folks. So we're just waiting for the technical folks to end the webinar here, but Thiago, has it been a good experience for you as well, I assume?
Oh yeah, it's just, again, like there's a fine balancing between being skeptical and being hopeful, right? Like science is about, shooting far, but being curious about your results. So do both, right? Like look to the stars, but kick your data in the ass to make sure that it's reliable. And that's how we move forward. And if anybody says that they can take you to the stars in 2 months, don't believe them, because it's a lie. Most likely.
Right on. Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
Thanks.